Okay. Well, that represents our four news story picks for the month, and now we move on to a pick for Muppet of the month, or I suppose Muppets of the month.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite hard to pull apart this story in terms of precisely who is being the Muppet. All we know is that there is Muppetry in the air somewhere in this instance. And I was drawn very quickly to this headline: Council accused of keeping 300 grave cemetery find. Hush, hush. I don't quite know where to begin. Do you want to?
Well, with this, I think we've got. You talk about Muppetry. I think we've got multiple Muppetry here because the whole thing. First of all, actually, it's a non-story, but the reason it became a story is it was completely cocked up by the archaeologists involved, who could have clarified from the moment the story first broke what was going on.
Yeah.
But because we're so bad at dealing with the media and making ourselves accountable in public in real time, this story got legs when it really never should have.
No. Well, but also actually in that instant, in that way, it is ironic. In so much as this isn't just about bad communication with the public, but also communication with our colleagues in, for example, local authorities, this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Essentially, a large pre-Christian cemetery containing around 300 graves, along with evidence of a horse burial, was unearthed in a village in Somerset, North Somerset.
In fact, close to the famous South Cadbury Hill Fort.
Ooh, okay. Any evidence of chocolate? No. But no. Anyway, so the important and complex site was discovered at Yatton last year during works to develop the land for housing. Yatton. That no, we're not going down that road. No, people of Somerset, they deserve dignity. But North Somerset Council has been accused.
That's right, they do.
North Somerset Council has been accused of keeping the find hush hush and of not informing residents. The council said it seems like a cover-up, but publicising cemetery excavations is not common practice. Now, it's not common practice because often, in the case of cemeteries, especially large cemeteries, there are items of interest to what we sometimes glamorously call night hawkers. Whether these are personal jewellery items buried with bodies, whether these are actually even the bones themselves. Sometimes this stuff will be lifted from these sites overnight when the archaeologists go home. So it is common practice to keep this stuff relatively quiet. It's also part of the licensing agreement that you don't suddenly, from in terms of governmental permission to excavate human remains, is you don't just sort of brandish human remains in a crude way. So having discretion around graveyards is standard practice. But the trip up here is when the archaeologists, and shall we name the archaeologist here?
If you want to.
Mr. Mark Horton, who we do like. I like Mark Horton, professor of archaeology at University of Bristol, said the
well
find
known for the pieces on Time Team and other documentaries.
Yeah. Could be an extensive early Christian Roman site, which would be of national significance. But he went on to say that I'm amazed that there hasn't been more public communication between the archaeologists, the developer, and the local the local community. Yeah, It's almost scandalous, he apparently said. And
where I have a problem with that is the addition of the almost scandalous, because I think you're quite right. Under the terms of a Home Office licence, you're not supposed to display human remains.
No.
For a number of reasons, one of which is that some people do find human remains upsetting or offensive. But also the primary reason is security. I remember talking to a colleague who was working on a Saxon cemetery, a pre-Christian cemetery up in Yorkshire, I think it was. And this was a development site, and they were about to break for Christmas. And the colleague was telling me how outside the security fence they could see the metal detectorists gathering to descend on the site the moment they were off site, and that what they were doing, what the archaeologists were doing, was scrabbling to lift everything that was visible that they were aware of before they broke, because they knew when they came back it wouldn't be there.
No, no. Yeah, and so,
we mustn't pretend that this stuff doesn't happen. There are thieves out there. They don't always use metal detectors. Sometimes they use JCBs to take whole loads of soil away, like they did at the temple in Surrey. But there are heritage thieves, and so keeping a site that is potentially, to use jargon, target rich, is absolutely sensible and essential. The problem is archaeologists not explaining this. I think partly for...
Well, actually, in this instance, the problem is an archaeologist doing the opposite of explaining this. In fact, it's suggesting that there's something wrong. So he goes on to say here, is quoted at least. This may not be actually a quote. Who knows? It may be out of context. But the BBC article has in quotation marks. It is normal procedure, even if the public aren't allowed inside, to put information on the outside about what's been found and it does seem to be really bad practice that there's such secrecy about this project. So in that case we have a couple of different layers of muppetry. We have the muppetry of the report, of the headline. We have the muppetry of the archaeologist here who's commenting in some respects, but also as well. It's interesting how you talk about. You seem to be quite determined to say, we must not pretend that this sort of stuff doesn't happen, and avoiding jargon. It's interesting how we do use jargon that sort of hides this undercurrent of as I say, so-called night hawking. So, for example, the Cat Lodge archaeologist for the council said they do usually give out information, but human remains made the site sensitive. Quote: It seems like we've been covering it up, but it's common practice not to publicise the excavation of cemeteries like this to avoid risking the integrity of the site. Now, at that point, that's a wonderful opportunity to highlight this problem as opposed to keeping it vague.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I when I read that quote, I just started tearing my hair out. We can talk about the integrity of the site amongst ourselves as professional archaeologists. We know what it means. We can, in the same way as we can talk about the heritage resource, because we know what it means in jargon terms. But please, 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 not when we're trying to communicate to the public.
Yeah,
we've got to learn to speak human.
Yeah, and especially in instances where it's being reported as hush hush. What the archaeologists don't want you to know, forbidden archaeology. The integrity of the site sounds like we're trying to edit it, I guess.
Exactly. And I think we're in a situation here that maybe doctors were a generation ago, where it was assumed that because you were a doctor, trust me, I'm a doctor, that a doctor could use any amount of jargon, whatever. The patient wasn't entitled to know the full details in language that they could understand of the condition that they were afflicted with. But now, after complaints and some awful cases of people not knowing things and families not knowing things and so not understanding things, doctors are now trained to communicate. And I think archaeologists should be too, because what we do really, when it comes to the heritage, while there might be short-term reasons for keeping something below the radar, like a cemetery dig, there is no excuse for not sharing and communicating as widely as possible once that immediate risk is lifted. I hate commercial. The idea of commercial secrecy, and to be fair, there was when the story first broke, there were hints that the developer didn't want the story more widely published because they were worried it would affect their development. The fact they already had planning permission was neither here nor there.
No. And this is also actually interesting as well, because at the end here, where you've had the archaeologist talking about integrity of the site. Then we have the final quoted statement is from the developer Boor Homes, Boor, In a statement, Boar Homes said no identified grave goods or datable artefacts had been found, and the skeletons are in varying states of survival. Now, it seems like a complete cock-up from an archaeological standpoint. You have two archaeologists essentially seeming at odds on what best practice is, and the developer, who has a vested interest in downplaying what archaeology is there, is left to make the sober statement on the condition of the site at the end. Now, this isn't again, just to highlight to those people who sometimes comment on this. This isn't us being anti-developer. Rather, it's simply not the developer's specialism. Should be their place to make the final statements on this.
You see, on the other hand, that could have come from the developer's archaeological consultant, who, although an archaeologist, also has a vested interest in not doing what the developer wants, but certainly coming up with conclusions that are favourable to the developer because they're paying the bill.
The dark side.
Well, as I've said many times before on these watching brief chats, we have to acknowledge, I think, archaeologists aren't always the good guys.
No.
In those kind of terms.
Yeah.
You know, there are many complexities and shades of grey in modern archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship between developer, consultant, and archaeological contracting unit is one of them.
Yeah.
But I think what we can all agree on, I think, is that heritage theft, whether it's done by somebody using a metal detector or just somebody getting onto the site with a shovel, we have to accept that happens too. And I am afraid that some archaeologists have been tempted to soft pedal the issue of theft using metal detectors because they don't want to offend the metal detecting community, which has a very effective lobby.
Mm. Yeah. Which is also an issue that we often touch in this series, in terms of how the archaeological community can better represent itself in public stages, which ultimately have a political impact as well. These news articles are a form, in that sense, of lobbying, and I can't help but think that in this instance, the archaeologists haven't come out looking as though they have a unified idea of what best practice is, which is unfortunate.
It's a lack of joined up thinking, and certainly a lack of thought through communication at a human level. As I say, archaeologists need to learn to talk, certainly talking to the public, less jargon and more human.
Muppets.